Welcome back to Major Intonio's presentation of Napoleon's Marshals by R.P. Dunn-Pattison. Chapter 9, Jacques Etienne Joseph Alexandre Macdonald, Marshal, Duke of Tarentum.
Jacques Etienne Joseph Alexandre Macdonald, Duke of Tarentum, was the son of a yeast crofter, Macdonald. The Macdonalds of yeast were a far-off sept of the Macdonalds of Clan Ranald. The future marshal's father was educated at the Scots College in Paris and was for some time a tutor in Clan Ranald's household. Owing to his knowledge of French, he was entrusted with the duty of helping Flora Macdonald to arrange the escape of Prince Charles. He accompanied the prince to France and obtained a commission in Ogilvy's regiment of foot. In 1768, Val Macdonald, or Neil Macdonald, as he was called in France, retired on a pension of £30 a year. On this pittance, he brought up his family at Sancerre. The future marshal was born at Sedan on November 17, 1765. He was educated for the army at a military academy in Paris, kept by a Scotchman, Paulet. But, owing to bad mathematics, he was unable to enter the artillery and engineering school. This failure came as a bitter blow to the keen young soldier, who, after reading Homer, already imagined himself an Achilles. But in 1784 his chance came. The Dutch, threatened by the Emperor Joseph II, had to improvise an army, and Macdonald accepted a pair of colors in a regiment raised by a Frenchman, the Count de Maillebois. A few months later, the regiment was disbanded, as the Dutch bought the peace they could not gain by arms. The young officer, thus thrown on his own resources, was glad to accept a cadetship in Dillon's Irish regiment in the French king's service, and at the moment the revolution broke out, he was a sub-lieutenant in that corps. Owing to emigration and the fortune of war, promotion came quickly. Macdonald also was lucky in having a friend in General Bernonville, on whose staff he served till he was transferred to that of Dumouriez, the commander-in-chief. As a reward for his services at Jemappes and elsewhere, he was made lieutenant colonel, and early in 1793, his friend Bernonville, who had become war minister, gave him his colonelcy and the command of the Picardy Regiment, one of the 4 senior corps of the old French infantry. The young colonel of 28 could not expect to be always so favored by fortune. Dumouriez's failure at Neerwinden and subsequent desertion to the Allies cast a cloud of suspicion on his protégé at a moment when to be suspected was to be condemned. Luckily, some of the commissioners from the convention could recognize merit, but Macdonald spent many anxious months amid denunciations and accusations from those who grudged him his colonelcy. To his intense surprise, he was at last summoned before the dread commissioners and told that, for his zeal, he was to be promoted general of brigade. Overcome by this unexpected turn of fortune, he wished to refuse the honor, and pleaded his youth and inexperience, and was promptly given the choice of accepting or becoming a suspect and being arrested. Safe for the moment, Macdonald threw himself heart and soul into his new duties, but still denunciations and accusations were hurled against him. Fresh commissioners came from the Assembly, and it was only their fortunate recall to Paris that saved the general from arrest. Then came the decree banishing all ci-devant nobles. Macdonald, fearing after this order that if he met with the slightest check he would be greeted with cries of treachery, demanded written orders from the new commissioners confirming him in his employment. These were refused, as also his resignation, with the curt reply, "If you leave the army, we will have you arrested and brought to trial." In this dilemma, he found a friend in the representative Isor, who, struck by his ability and industry, took up his cause, and from that moment Macdonald had nothing to fear from the Revolutionary Tribunal. In November 1794, he was quite unexpectedly gazetted General of Division in the army of Pichegru, and took part in the winter campaign against Holland, where he proved his capacity by seizing the occasion of a hard frost to cross the Vaal on the ice and surprise the Anglo-Hanoverian force at Nijmegen. A few days later, during the general advance, he captured Naarden, the masterpiece of the great engineer Cohorn. Proud of his success, he hastened to inform the commander-in-chief, Pichegru, and was greeted by a laugh, and "Bah, I pay no attention now to anything less than the surrender of provinces." The blasé commander-in-chief a week or two later himself performed the exploit of capturing the ice-bound Dutch fleet with a cavalry brigade and a battery of horse artillery. After serving on the Rhine in 1796, Macdonald was transferred in 1798 to the Army of Italy and sent to Rome to relieve Gouvion Saint-Cyr. When war broke out between France and Naples, the troops in southern Italy were formed into the Army of Naples under Championnet. The commander-in-chief overrated the fighting qualities of the Neapolitan troops and thought it prudent to evacuate Rome. Macdonald was entrusted with this duty and was further required to cover the concentration of Championet's army. The hard-headed Scotchman had, however, gauged to a nicety the morale of the Neapolitan army, and although he had but 5,000 troops against 40,000 Neapolitans under the celebrated Austrian general Mack, he engaged the enemy at Civita Castellana, defeated them, followed them up, drove them out of Rome and over the frontier, and practically annihilated the whole force. Unfortunately, he wrote a comical account of the operations to his chief, who, having no sense of humor, felt that his evacuation of Rome had, to say the least of it, been hurried and undignified. Championnet, therefore, greeted his victorious lieutenant with the words, "You want to make me pass for a damned fool," and no explanations could appease his rage. So bitter became the quarrel that Macdonald had to resign his command. By February 1799, Championnet had fallen into disgrace with the Directory, and Macdonald was gazetted in his place commander-in-chief. When he arrived in Naples and took up his command, the situation seemed quiet, but the far-seeing soldier read the signs of the times. The elite of the French army was locked up in Egypt. Austria and Russia were bent on extinguishing France and her revolutionary ideas. Accordingly, the general at once set about quietly concentrating his troops to meet an invasion of northern Italy by the Allies. With his keen military insight, he desired to evacuate all southern Italy, retaining only such fortresses as could be well supplied. But the principle of keeping everything gained the day. Still, on the news of Scherer's defeat at Magnano by the impetuous Suvorov, the army of Naples was ready at once to start for the north, and set off to try and pick up communication with General Moreau, who was reforming the Army of Italy at Genoa. The idea was that a concentrated movement should be made against the Allies through the Apennines. Unfortunately, there existed a bitter rivalry between the Army of Italy and the Army of Naples. Consequently, on June 17th, Macdonald found himself with 25,000 men near Piacenza, in the presence of the enemy, with no support save 2 divisions of the Army of Italy, which had come in from Bologna, and whose commanders were jealous of his orders. Still, there was always the hope that Moreau might after all be coming to his assistance, and accordingly he determined to stand and fight. In the action of June 17th, owing to the lack of cooperation from one of the attached divisions, the general was ridden over by a division of the enemy's cavalry. Carried about in a litter, he directed all movements during the 18th and held the enemy at bay along the mountain torrent of the Trebbia. On the 19th, he determined to take the initiative, but owing to the collapse of the attached division, which formed his center, he had to fall back on his old position, which he held throughout the whole day. During the 3 days fighting on the Trebbia, the French had lost a third of their men and nearly all their officers. Still, early on the morning of the 20th, the retreat was effected in good order, save that one of the attached divisions under Victor started so late that it was overtaken by the enemy and abandoned all its guns. But Macdonald at once returned to its aid and saved the artillery, for, as he sarcastically wrote to Victor, he found neither friends nor foes. Both sides had run away. The Battle of the Trebbia brought into notice the sterling qualities of the French commander, and when he was recalled to Paris, he found that military opinion was on his side and that Bonaparte himself highly approved of his conduct. Thenceforward, the opinion of my amphitryon was settled in my favor. Macdonald's next employment was in command of the Army of the Grisons, whose duty was to cover Moreau's right rear in his advance down the Danube, and to keep up communication with the Army of Italy in the valley of the Po. It was in the performance of this duty that the Army of the Grisons crossed the Splugen Pass in winter, in spite of glaciers and avalanches, a feat immeasurably superior to Bonaparte's task in crossing the much easier Great St. Bernard Pass after the snows had melted. Unfortunately for Macdonald, Bonaparte believed him to belong to Moreau's faction. After Hohenlinden, the future emperor, who was afraid that Moreau's glory would outshine his own, placed all that general's friends on the Black Book. Further, owing to his outspokenness, Talleyrand had conceived a hatred of the hero of the Splugen. Accordingly, he found himself in deep disgrace. First, he was exiled as ambassador at Copenhagen. Then his enemies tried to get him sent to Russia in the same capacity, but he refused to go, and for the next few years lived the life of a quiet country gentleman on his estate of Courcelles-le-Roi. Like most of the generals, Macdonald was by now comparatively well off, for the French government, on the conquest of a country, had allowed its generals to take what works of art they chose, after the commissioners had selected the best for the national collection at the Louvre. The general's share as commander-in-chief at Naples had been valued by experts at £34,000. Unfortunately, however, this booty and many masterpieces which he had bought himself were all lost in the hurried march north that ended in the Battle of the Trebia. It was not till 1809 that Macdonald was summoned from his retreat. In that year, the emperor needed every soldier of ability, with the Spanish ulcer eating at his vitals and the war with Austria on his hands. Accordingly, at a day's notice, he was ordered to hurry off to Italy to help Napoleon's stepson, Prince Eugene, who was opposed by an Austrian army under the Archduke John. On arriving in Italy, the old soldier found that Prince Eugene, unaccustomed to an independent command, had opened the gate of Italy to the Austrians by his impetuous action at Sacile. The French troops were in complete disorganization, and the slightest activity on the part of the Austrians would have turned the retreat into a rout. Prince Eugene, who was without a spark of jealousy and in reality a man of considerable character, greeted his mentor with delight. Macdonald at once pointed out that it was unnecessary to retire as far as Mantua, because the Archduke would not venture to penetrate far into Italy until a decision had been arrived at between the main armies on the Danube. Under his careful supervision, order and discipline were restored among the French troops on the line of the Adige. The news of the French success at Eckmühl and Ratisbon automatically cleared the Austrians out of northern Italy. During the pursuit, the general had to impose on himself the severest self-control, because, though Prince Eugene invariably accepted his advice, the disaster at Sacile had for the time broken his nerve, and again, he spoiled his mentor's best combinations by ordering a halt whenever the enemy appeared to be going to offer any resistance. It was hard indeed to accept subsequent apologies with a courteous smile, when it was success alone that would win back the emperor's favor. But at last, patience had its reward. While the viceroy himself pursued the main force of the enemy, he detached his lieutenant with a strong corps to take Trieste and to pick up communication with Marmont, who was bringing up the army of Dalmatia. Macdonald was given carte blanche. Trieste and Gorze were taken. The junction with Marmont was speedily effected, and the combined forces hurried on towards Vienna. The great entrenched camp at Laybach blocked the way. Macdonald had not the necessary heavy artillery with which to capture it. He determined, therefore, to make a threatening demonstration by day and slip past it by night. But at 10 o'clock in the evening, a flag of truce arrived offering a capitulation. "You are doing wisely," said the imperturbable Scotchman. "I was just going to sound the attack." At Gratz, he overtook Prince Eugene's army at the moment that the ill news of the Battle of Aspern-Essling arrived. Then came the summons to hurry to the assistance of the emperor. After marching 60 leagues in 3 days, the army of Italy arrived at 9 o'clock at night on July 4th at the imperial headquarters at Ebersdorf. During that night, it crossed the Danube under cover of the terrific thunderstorm which hid the French advance from the Austrians. On the afternoon of July 5th, it fell to the lot of Macdonald to attempt to seize the plateau which formed the Austrian center. As the general well knew, the emperor had been mistaken in thinking that the enemy were evacuating their position. Still, he had to obey orders, and night alone saved his cruelly shaken battalions. Next day was fought the terrible Battle of Wagram. At the critical moment of the fight, when the emperor heard that MASSÉNA, on his left wing, was being driven in on the bridgehead, amid the confusion and rout, he ordered MacDonald to attempt by a bold counterstroke to break the enemy's center. The Austrians were advancing in masses, with nothing in front of them, and the bridge, the only line of retreat, was threatened. To meet this situation, MacDonald deployed 4 battalions in line at the double. Behind them, he formed up the rest of his corps in 2 solid columns and closed the rear of this immense rectangle of troops by Nansoudi's cavalry. Covered by the fire of a massed battery of 100 guns, he discharged this huge body of 30,000 troops against the Austrians, and in spite of vast losses from the enemy's artillery, by sheer weight of human beings, he completely checked the Austrian advance and broke their center. If the cavalry of the Guard had only charged home, the enemy would have been driven off the field in complete rout. Still unsupported, the column continued its victorious career, taking 6,000 prisoners and 10 guns, the only trophies of the day. Next morning, the hero of Wagram, lame from the effect of a kick from his horse, was summoned before the emperor. Napoleon embraced him with the words, "Let us be friends." "Till death," replied his staunch lieutenant. Then came his reward. "You have behaved valiantly," continued the emperor, "and have rendered me the greatest services, as indeed throughout the entire campaign. On the battlefield of your glory, where I owe you so large a share of yesterday's success, I make you a Marshal of France. You have long deserved it." After the ratification of peace, the emperor created his new marshal Duke of Tarentum, granted him a present of 60,000 francs, and presented him with the Grand Cordon of the Legion of Honor. Having at last regained the emperor's favor, the marshal had never again to complain of lack of employment. From Wagram, he was sent to watch the army of the Archduke John. Thereafter, he was appointed commander-in-chief of the Army of Italy. In 1810, he was dispatched to Spain to take command in Catalonia. Like his fellow marshals, MacDonald hated the Spanish War, which was a war of posts and devoid of glory. But he showed his versatility by capturing, without artillery, the stronghold of Figueras. It was while suffering from a bad attack of gout after this success that he was summoned from Spain to Tilsit, to command the corps comprised of Prussian troops, which was to join the Grand Army in its advance into Russia. As he graphically put it, "I had left my armchair in the fortress of Figueras. I left one crutch in Paris and the other in Berlin." The Duke of Tarentum's duty was to guard the Tête du Pont at Duneberg, near the mouth of the Dwina. Consequently, he was spared a great many of the horrors of the terrible retreat. Still, he had his full share of troubles, for the Prussians deserted him and went over to the enemy. So confident was he of the loyalty of his subordinates that this desertion took him quite unawares, and, in spite of warnings, he waited for the divisions to rejoin him, declaring that, "My life, my career, shall never be stained with the reproach that I have committed the cowardly action of deserting troops committed to my care." Fortunately, his eyes were opened by letters which he intercepted. With a handful of troops, he escaped to Danzig. On returning to Paris, MacDonald was greeted with a cold reception by the emperor, who thought that the desertion of the Prussians was due to his negligence. But the marshal's character was soon cleared, and a reconciliation followed. In the campaign of 1813, it fell to the lot of the Duke of Tarentum to watch the Prussian army under Blücher in Silesia, while the emperor operated against the Austrians round Dresden. Whilst thus employed, he was defeated on August 26th at the Katzbach. The Prussians had established themselves on the heights at Jauer. MacDonald attempted, by a combined frontal attack and a turning movement, to dislodge them. Unfortunately, the rain came down in torrents. The French artillery became embedded in the mud. The infantry could not fire, the cavalry could not charge, and a hurried retreat alone saved the army from absolute annihilation. For, as MacDonald wrote in his dispatch, "The generals cannot prevent the men from seeking shelter, as their muskets are useless to them." The repulse at the Katzbach did not weaken the emperor's esteem for the marshal, and a few days later he sent to inquire his views of the general situation. With absolute courage, he told the truth. The situation was hopeless. The only wise course was to evacuate all garrisons in Germany and retire on the Saale. Unfortunately, such a retirement would have meant the loss of Napoleon's throne. On the third day of the Battle of Leipzig, in the midst of the action, Macdonald was deserted by all the Hessian troops under his command, and at the same time, Marshal Augereau, who was supposed to cover his right, withdrew from the combat. Accordingly, the marshal retired with the remnants of his corps to the Elster, only to find the bridge blown up. Dragged along by the crowd of fugitives, he determined not to fall alive into the hands of the enemy, but either to drown or shoot himself. More fortunate, however, than Prince Poniatowski, he managed to cross the river on his horse. Once safely across, he was greeted by cries from the other bank, "Monsieur le Maréchal, save your soldiers, save your children." But there was nothing to be done. No advice could he give them save to surrender. The Duke of Tarentum was mainly instrumental in saving the remnants of the army which had managed to cross the Elster. Going straight to the emperor, he laid the situation before him, ruthlessly tore aside the tissue of lies with which the staff were trying to cajole him, and, by his force of will, compelled Napoleon, who for the time was quite unnerved and mazed, to hurry on the retreat to the Rhine. It was entirely owing to the marshal that the Bavarians were brushed aside at Hanau, and that some few remnants of the great army regained France. In the famous campaign of 1814, Macdonald fought fiercely to drive the enemy out of France. His corps was one of those which the emperor summoned to Arcis-sur-Aube. There again, he had to tell Napoleon the truth and convince him that the enemy were not retreating, but were in full advance on Paris. When the emperor tried to retrieve his mistake by following in the rear, the marshal was in favor of the bolder course of advancing into Alsace and Lorraine, and of raising the nation in arms, and thus starving out the Allies by cutting off their supplies and reinforcements. And no doubt he was right, for the Tsar himself said that the Allies lost more than 3,000 troops in the Vosges without seeing a single French soldier. When Napoleon reached Fontainebleau, he found that he had shot his bolt. So tired were his officers and men of continual fighting that, when ordered to charge, a general officer in front of his men had called out, "Damn it, let us have peace!" Consequently, when Macdonald and the other marshals and generals were informed that the Allies would no longer treat with Napoleon, they determined to make him abdicate. The emperor, on summoning his council, found that they no longer feared him and refused to listen to his arguments. Hoping to save the throne for his son, he dispatched Caulaincourt, Ney, Marmont, and Macdonald to the Tsar, offering to abdicate. The best terms the commissioners could get from the Tsar were that Napoleon must give up all hope of seeing his son succeed him, but that he should retain his imperial title and should be allowed to rule the island of Elba. The Tsar magnanimously added, "If he will not accept this sovereignty, and if he can find no shelter elsewhere, tell him, I say, to come to my dominions. There he shall be received as a sovereign. He can trust the word of Alexander." Ney and Marmont did not accompany the other commissioners with their sorrowful terms. Like rats, they left the sinking ship. But Macdonald was of a strain which had stood the test of the 45, and his proud Scotch blood boiled up when the insidious Talleyrand suggested that he should desert his master, telling him that he had now fulfilled all his engagements and was free. "No, I am not," was the stern reply, "and nobody knows better than you that, as long as a treaty has not been ratified, it may be annulled. After that formality is ended, I shall know what to do." The stricken emperor met his two faithful commissioners, his face haggard, his complexion yellow and sickly, but for once at least he felt gratitude. "I have loaded with favors," he said, "many others who have now deserted and abandoned me. You, who owe me nothing, have remained faithful. I appreciate your loyalty too late, and I sincerely regret that I am now in a position in which I can only prove my gratitude by words." After Napoleon started for Elba, Macdonald never saw him again. Like all his fellow marshals, except Davout, he swore allegiance to Louis XVIII, looking on him as the only hope of France. But unlike the most of them, he served him loyally, though, as he truly said, the government behaved like a sick man who is utterly indifferent to all around him. As a soldier and a liberal, he could not disguise his repugnance for many of its measures. As secretary to the Chamber of Peers, he fought tooth and nail against the government's first measure, a bill attempting to restrict the liberties of the peers. The king summoned the marshal and rebuked him for both speaking and voting against the government, adding, "When I take the trouble to draw up a bill, I have good reasons for wishing it to pass." But the old soldier, who had never feared to speak the truth to Napoleon himself, was not to be overawed by the attempted sternness of the feeble Bourbon. He pointed out that if all bills presented by the king were bound to pass, registration would serve equally well, since to you belongs the initiative, adding with quiet sarcasm, "and we must remain as mute as the late corps legislatif." The chancellor stopped him as he left the king's presence, telling him he should show more reserve and pick his words. "Sir Chancellor," said the marshal, "I have never learned to twist myself, and I pity the king if what he ought to know is concealed from him. For my part, I shall always speak to him honestly and serve him in the same manner." When neglect of the army, the partiality shown to favorites, and the general spirit of discontent throughout France tempted Napoleon once again to seize the reins of government, Macdonald was commanding the 21st Military Division at Bourges. As he says, "The news of the emperor's return took away my breath, and I at once foresaw the misfortunes that have since settled upon France." Placing his duty to his country and his plighted faith before the longings of his heart, he remained faithful to the Bourbons. It was the marshal who at Lyons vainly endeavored to aid the Count of Artois to organize resistance to Napoleon's advance. It was he who showed the king the vanity of Ney's boast that he would bring back the emperor in an iron cage, who impressed on him Napoleon's activity, and who persuaded him to retire northwards to Lille and there attempt to rally his friends to his aid. Ministers and king were only too thankful to leave all arrangements to this cautious, indefatigable soldier, who supervised everything. Through every town the monarch passed, he found the same feeling of apathy, the same tendency among the troops to cry, "Vive l'Empereur," the same lack of enterprise among the officials. Typical of the situation was the sub-prefect of Bethune, who stood at the door of the royal carriage, one leg half naked, his feet in slippers, his coat under his arm, his waistcoat unbuttoned, his hat on his head, one hand struggling with his sword, the other trying to fasten his necktie. The marshal, ever mindful of Napoleon's activity, had to hurry the poor king, and Louis's portmanteau, with his 6 clean shirts and his old pair of slippers, got lost on the road. This loss, more than anything else, brought home to the monarch his pitiable condition. "They have taken my shirts," said he to Macdonald. "I had not too many in the first place, but what I regret still more is the loss of my slippers. Some day, my dear Marshal, you will appreciate the value of slippers that have taken the shape of your feet." With Napoleon at Paris, Lille seemed to offer but little security, and accordingly, the king determined to seek safety in Belgium. The marshal escorted him to the frontier and saw him put in charge of the Belgian troops. Then, promising to be faithful to his oath, he took an affectionate farewell of the old monarch with the words, "Farewell, sir, au revoir in 3 months." Macdonald returned to Paris and lived quietly in his own house, refusing to have any intercourse with Napoleon or his ministers. Within 3 months came the news of Waterloo. Thereafter, against his will, but in accordance with orders, he joined Fouché, who had established a provisional government. Fouché, who knew the importance of outward signs, sent him off to try and persuade the returning monarch to win over the army by mounting the tricolor instead of the white cockade. But the king was obstinate. The marshal quoted Henry IV's famous saying, "Paris is worth a mass." The king countered with, "Yes, but it was not a very Catholic one." But though the king would not listen to his advice, he called on him to show his devotion. The imperial army had to be disbanded, a most unpopular and thankless task, requiring both tact and firmness. At his sovereign's earnest request, Macdonald undertook the duty, but with 2 stipulations. First, that he should have complete freedom of action. Secondly, that he should be in no way an instrument for inflicting punishment on individuals. Immediately on taking up his appointment at Bourges, the marshal summoned all the generals and officers to his presence and informed them that, under Fouché's supervision, a list of proscribed had been drawn up. His advice was that all on this list should fly at once. That same evening, police officials arrived in the camp to arrest the proscribed. Playing on the fears of the mouchards, he locked them up all night, alleging that it was to save them from the infuriated soldiery. Thus all the proscribed escaped, but neither Fouché nor the Duc de Berry cared to bring the old soldier to task for this action. So the marshal was left to work in his own way, and by October 21st, 1815, thanks to his firmness and tact, the bold and unhappy army, which had for so long been triumphant, was quietly dissolved without the slightest attempt at challenging the royal decision. The marshal did not mix much in politics. The king, at the Second Restoration, created him Arch-Chancellor of the Legion of Honor. This post gave him considerable occupation, as it entailed the supervision of the schools for the children of those who had received the cross. And he was for long happily employed in looking after the welfare of the descendants of his late comrades in arms. In November 1830, the plea of the gout came opportunely at the moment of the commencement of the July monarchy, and the marshal resigned the arch-chancellorship and returned to his estate of Courcelles, where he lived in retirement till his death. On September 25, 1840, at the age of 75, it was a maxim of Napoleon that success covers everything, that it is only failure which cannot be forgiven. Against the Duke of Tarentum's name stood the defeats of Trebia and the Katzbach. But in spite of this, Napoleon never treated him as he treated Dupont and the other unfortunate generals. For Macdonald possessed qualities which were too important to be overlooked. With all the fiery enthusiasm of the Gael, he possessed to an unusual degree the caution of the Lowland Scot. Possessed of great reasoning powers and of the gift of seeing clearly both sides of a question, he had the necessary force of character to make up his mind which course to pursue, and to persevere in it to the logical issue. In the crossing of the Vaal, in the fighting round Rome, in the campaign with Prince Eugène in Italy, before and after Leipzig, and in his final campaign in France, he proved the correctness of his judgment and his capacity to work out his carefully prepared combinations. His defeat at the Trebia was due to the treachery of the general commanding one of the attached divisions. The rout at the Katzbach was primarily due to climatic conditions and to the want of cohesion among the recently drafted recruits, which formed the bulk of his army. On the stricken field of Wagram, and in the running fight at Hanau, his inflexible will and the quickness with which he grasped the vital points of the problem saved the emperor and his army. The only black spot in his otherwise glorious career is the Battle of Leipzig. Long must the cry of "Monsieur le Maréchal, save your soldiers, save your children," have rung in his ear. For once he had forgotten his proud boast that he never deserted troops entrusted to his command. Like the emperor and his fellow marshals and most of the generals, for the moment he lost his nerve. But he could still, though humbly, boast that he was the first to remember his duties and to try and save the remnant of the troops who had crossed the Elster. Duty and truth were his watchwords. Once only he failed in his duty. Never did he shirk telling the truth. It was this fearless utterance of the truth, more than any connection with Murat, which was the cause of his long years of disgrace. It was this fearlessness, strange to say, which, in the end, conquered the emperor, and which so charmed King Louis that he nicknamed him his outspokenness.
This concludes Chapter 9 of Napoleon's Marshals by R. P. Dunn-Pattison. Join us also for Chapter 10, about Auguste Marmont. Subscribe to Major Intonio's channel. We'll get back to you next week. Thank you very much, and so long.